The Satanic Mill by Otfried Preussler. The second year, 9, the end of the row. The next day the miller left his men in peace, and only the welt on Michael's throat was left to remind them how hard the master had driven them for weeks, night after night. Now they could go about their work in daylight again, which gave them no trouble to speak of, and they stopped at nightfall when they could do as they pleased, play the Jew's harp, tell stories, whittle spoons. Everything was the same as before. The blisters on their hands dried up. The sore places on their chests and backs soon healed. When the master read to them from the book of necromancy on Friday evening, they were eager to learn again, and learn they did. When he asked questions, Juro was usually the one to get stuck, and that was nothing new. A few days after Michaelmas, the master sent Petar and Krabbet to Hoyerswerda to buy a cask of salt and all sorts of other kitchen stuff. The miller never let one of his men out on his own. If there was something to be done in the outside world, he sent at least 2 together. And it was to be supposed he had his reasons for that, or else his instructions. The 2 of them set off at dawn in the rack wagon, with the bays between the shafts. It was misty over the fen, but once they had the wood behind them, the sun rose and the mist dispersed. Schwartz column lay ahead of them. Krabbet was hoping to catch sight of the singer, and he looked out for her as they drove through the village, but in vain. She was not among the girls standing by the lower well, with their buckets chattering, nor at the upper well, nor was she anywhere else to be seen that morning. Krabbet was sorry. He would have liked to see her again. Easter night was a long time ago. Perhaps I will be in luck when we go home this afternoon, he thought. Maybe it would be better not to hope, and then he needn't be disappointed later. But as they were going home from Hoyerswerda with their cask of salt and the other things that afternoon, his wish was granted after all. There she was, standing not far from the lower of the 2 village wells, surrounded by a flock of cackling chickens. She had a basket in her hand, and she was scattering food for them. Chick, 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 chick. Krabbet recognized her at first glance, and as they drove by, he nodded to her, quite casually because he did not want Petar noticing anything. The girl nodded back in an equally casual, though friendly way, as one nods to a passing stranger, but her mind was on the chickens she was feeding. There was a fine speckled rooster among the chickens, busily pecking up the grain at her feet. Just then Krabbet envied that rooster with all his heart, and if it had been possible, he would have changed places with him on the spot. The weather was dreary before winter set in that year, chilly and gray, with mist and rain. They used the few dry days to bring in peat and spent the rest of their time in the mill, the shed and the stable, the granary or the barn. Everyone was glad to have work that would not take him out in the rain. Vitko had grown a lot since spring, but he was still thin. We'll have to put a brick on his head to weigh him down, or he'll be shooting right away from us, said Andrush, and Stashko suggested fattening him up like a Michaelmas goose. He needs a bit of flesh on those bones to keep him from looking like a scarecrow. The first down was beginning to appear on Vitko's chin, and upper lip too. It was red, of course. Vitko did not notice, but Krabbet did. Watching Vitko, he could see how a boy could grow 3 years older in a single year of time. The first snow of the winter fell on St. Andrew's Day, quite late in the year. Once again, the journeymen at the mill in the fen grew restless, taciturn, and quarrelsome. They would pick a fight at the slightest provocation, and as the weeks went by, there were few days when at least one of them did not fly at someone else. Krabbet remembered the conversation he had had with Tonda about this time last year. Were the men afraid to their very bones because once again one of them was to die? How had he not come to think of that before? He had seen the waste ground and the row of low mounds, 7 or 8 of them, perhaps more. He had not counted them. Now he knew why the men were afraid. Now he shared their fear. Any one of them, with the possible exception of Vitko, might be the victim this year, but who would it be and why? Krabbet dared not ask any of his companions, not even Michael. He took out Tonda's knife more often than usual to snap it open and look at the blade. The blade was always shining, so he himself did not seem to be in danger, but it might be different tomorrow. There was a coffin ready in the woodshed. Krabbet discovered it, by accident when he went to fetch wood the day before Christmas Eve. It was covered with a piece of canvas, and Crabbit would hardly have noticed it, but for barking his shins on it in passing. Who had made that coffin? How long had it been standing there, and who was it for? That last question left Crabbit no peace. It occupied his mind for the rest of the day, and even followed him into his dreams. Crabbit has found a coffin in the woodshed, a pine coffin covered with a piece of canvas. Casually or cautiously, he opens it and looks inside. It is empty. He decides to chop the coffin up. He cannot bear to think of it standing there waiting for someone. Crabbit sets to work with his hatchet. He pries the boards apart and splits them from top to bottom. Then he chops them into small, handy pieces, intending to put them in a basket and take them in to Juro. But as he is looking around for a basket, crack! The coffin has put itself together again. It is intact, all in one piece. Crabbit attacks it with his hatchet for a second time and chops it to matchwood. But no sooner has he done so than crack! The coffin is back again. In a fury now, the young man tries for it the third time. He chops and hacks until the splinters fly, until the coffin is nothing but a heap of tiny shavings. But it is no good. Crack! There is the coffin, put together again without a scratch on it, waiting for its destined occupant. Horror seizes Crabbit. He runs out into the fen. Snow is falling, thick flurries of snow blinding him. He does not know where he is running to, and he fears the coffin may follow him. After a while he stops to listen. No sound of wooden feet, no hollow rattling as he feared. Instead, quite close, there is a grating, scraping sound like someone digging in stony frozen ground. Following the sound, Crabbit comes to the waste ground, and through the driving snow he makes out a figure digging a hole with a spade and pick at the far end of the row of mounds near the wood, at the very spot where Crabbit's one extra flower fell to the ground in summer. Crabbit thinks he recognizes the figure. He knows it is one of the miller's men, but he cannot be sure which. He opens his mouth to call, "Hey, who are you?" His voice fails him. He cannot utter a sound, and he finds it impossible to go a step further. He stays where he is. His feet are frozen to the ground. He cannot move them. The devil take it, he thinks. Have I gone lame? I must take those few steps. I must. He breaks out in a sweat as he summons up his last reserves of strength, but his feet will not obey him. Do what he will, he cannot move from the spot, and it snows, and gradually the snow covers him up. Crabbit woke, bathed in sweat. He threw back the blanket and tore the clammy shirt from his body. Then he went to the attic window and looked out. Christmas Day had dawned. It had snowed overnight, and he saw a fresh trail of footsteps leading into the fen. When he went out to wash at the pump, Michael came up the path with a pick and a spade. He was stooping as he walked, dragging his feet, and his face was pale. Crabbit was about to speak to him, but Michael waved him away, and indeed they understood each other without saying a word. Michael was a changed man after that. He kept aloof from Crabbit and all the others, even Merton, as if there were a wall between him and them, as if he were already far away. So New Year's Eve came. The master did not put in an appearance. He had been gone since morning. Night fell, and the miller's men went to bed. Although he had made up his mind to stay awake, Crabbit fell asleep like the others. He woke at midnight and began to listen. Somewhere in the house there was a dull thud, then a scream, and then silence. Merton, the huge, bear-like, broad-shouldered Merton, began to sob like a child. Crabbit pulled the blanket up over his ears, dug his fingers into the straw mattress, and wished he were dead. They found Michael on New Year's Day. In the morning, he was lying on the floor of the meal store. A beam had fallen from the ceiling and broken his neck. They put him on a plank and carried him into the servants' hall, and there they said their farewells to him. Juro took off his clothes, washed him, and laid him in the pine coffin with a handful of straw under his neck. They took him out to the waste ground that afternoon and lowered him into the hole at the far end of the row of mounds, near the wood. They buried him hastily and did not spend a moment longer than necessary at his gravesite. Only Merton stayed behind. And that's the end of the second year.